I heard several talks today already, and I think Courtney's introduction and then the talk that I'm going to do, we had no collab there. I had no idea what she was going to mention. She talked about creation. She talked about light. She talked about how we are little creators in a way, and that's what I want to get to, which is that in the book of Genesis, we have a kind of a worldview, a philosophy that's presented, and that presentation is a worldview where there is an uncreated light at the beginning. Uncreated light stamps order upon the created being that he speaks into being. It's going to be very important that we understand who that logos is, that it's a he, not an it, not an abstraction, not a reductionist principle. It's an actual living thing. And so we're going to get into logos versus inversion. And there's a lot of inversion going on right now. In fact, very adjacent to this place. There's some pretty inverted things. And the problem here is not to be mean to people or to provoke, but I want to challenge a lot of you here because we talk about liberty. We talk about being free. Okay, what does that mean? What does it mean to be free? Free from what? Free to do what? What is liberty? Liberty seems to assume certain things. It seems to assume a being that has the liberty. Free will assumes personhood. It assumes volition, action. It assumes the ability to choose between virtue and vice. All of those things are presupposed in the idea of liberty. So liberty is not this self-evident idea. It's a principle that comes with a context, with a worldview that gives it, as well as all the other ideas in that worldview, meaning. In Genesis, we have a movement from the beginning of the created order, from an uncreated order. That created order begins as a kind of chaos. Jordan Peterson's chaos. Not Jordan Peterson's chaos, but kind of, sort of, right? It moves from chaos to order. That movement in Genesis 1 is mirrored in John 1, where we have the presentation of the Logos himself there. John 1 is a play on Genesis 1. It's a restatement of the narrative of Genesis 1. And in John 1, that uncreated light reveals himself in a much more powerful, dynamic way than in Genesis 1. But John 1 is noting that the Logos word of John 1 is the Logos word in Genesis 1. That uncreated light that's spoken of again in John 1 is the presupposition of liberty. So what I'm trying to get at was when Courtney mentioned light, freedom, liberty, enlightenment, the true notions of light, freedom, liberty, etc., actually come from a principle called logos. Logos in philosophy is reason, order, logic, explanation, exegesis. All of these things relate to the term, the notion, the idea of logos. Is there order in the world? Is there structure in the world? Is structure, order, meaning, etc., are all those things that we impose upon society? Most of society today thinks that meaning, order, telos, purpose, all of those things are social constructs that you cause them to be. You can be whoever you want to be. You can identify as whoever you want to identify as. Right? If I decide I'm Jeff Goldblum today, am I Jeff Goldblum? If I decide that I'm Jeff Goldblum and I'm doing chaos math, no, I don't become Jeff Goldblum. I don't become Bill Gates, right? If I let loose the mosquitoes and depopulate you all, right? I'm still not Bill Gates. I can't be, I was going to do a whole bunch of these voices. Like, can I be Nicolas Cage? Yes, I can actually, in fact, be Nicolas Cage. But not really, not in reality, right? You can't be whatever you want to be in that sense. So we're limited. Now, is that bad? Is that some sort of a imposition by an evil demiurge creator that's imprisoning us? No. My point is that the fundamental structure of the universe itself is law-like. It has order. It has logos within it. That means that for us to be free, to have liberty, it requires law. I don't mean human law. Human law might reflect divine law, eternal law, or it might not. It might be unjust. But you can't get away from objective, eternal, metaphysical principles of divine law. Even if we think we can create our own meaning and law, it does not become so merely by our fiat. We do not have a divine fiat. However, we have a mirrored divine fiat, a little divine. We can be little gods in a sense, as Jesus says. I have said ye are gods. That, however, is not something that's achieved by our own initiatives. In fact, I would argue that the world itself is in a process of a kind of false order, a dark logic, so to speak. And we're going to look at some key examples of that dark logic here in a second. In fact, this inversion order or disorder, I'm going to contrast that with the logos order. So logos, light, liberty, versus inversion, dark logic, enslavement, etc. Yet it promises liberty. And the amazing thing is that when we look at the progress, for example, of Genesis to the book of John, and then John's later text, the book of Revelation, we find that the movement from Eden to wilderness after the fall, and then to restored garden city is a logical telos movement in history that brings us to an end goal which gives meaning. This is an eternal meaning. This is why it's so important that meaning cannot be reduced to only this life, only the here and the now, only material existence. If you reduce meaning to that, there is no meaning. Meaning fades, it dies as soon as you go away. But as Leibniz pointed out at one point in one of his essays about metaphysics, he said, isn't it true that, say, any event in the past, Caesar crossing the Rubicon, isn't it still true that Caesar did that? So there's something about an event and the truth of that event that continues on even after the event. And so Leibniz argued, I think correctly, that we could speak to the eternality of truth even in these historical examples. So again, history can't be purposeless. It can't be dysteleological, just a fancy word for no order, no meaning, no goal. Telos means purpose. It means end goal. It means where everything, me, you, all of us, all of reality, where it's going, where it's moving towards. Now, in our own lives, we can understand the small g God principle of being little creators, music, art, whatever. We can understand the principle of having an end goal for something that we've done. We're working together to write this great piece of music, et cetera, et cetera. And even evil things can have an end goal. But those end goals in terms of evil are actually privations, they're actually negations, because they don't continue on into eternity. They become negations, they become things that don't continue in being. Now, I'm not trying to be too philosophical, just trying to make some philosophical points that I think undergird, that are kind of clear if you think about it. The notions of liberty, freedom, the notions of choosing virtue over vice. Now, let's take that. Let's say we believe in free will. Free will requires some kind of worldview that gives an account for the being that has the freedom. Free will is a metaphysical concept in philosophy. And so we need some account of the persons that do the willing. Free will assumes that there's a choice between virtue and vice. Not all actions are equal, clearly. So if not all actions are equal and some actions are choices of virtue, some actions are choices of vice, there must be some metaphysical objective standard, the good, by which the virtues aim to achieve. Virtues have the likeness to the good. What is the good, though? right? The ancient philosophers asked this question. Religions asked this question. But do you understand what I'm saying is that if you talk about liberty, if you talk about free will, you're assuming these things. You're assuming the good. You're assuming virtue, distinct from vice. You're assuming these principles. You're assuming that there's an agent that's able to make those choices. What is an agent? Are we just determined chemical reactions like Richard Dawkins says? You're all just determined chemical reactions. You're all snakes. That's my Richard Dawkins. Are we determined beings? Or do we have the ability to choose? Again, most of the new atheists, the known philosophers so-called out there, they would say, no, you don't actually make choices. You don't actually have freedom. Those are ideas that are in your head. They don't exist in reality. Well, those are the same people who tell us that there's no truth, except science is truth, except science doesn't give you objective truth, except science is also embodied in a person named Fauci. I am science. He's science incarnate. Interesting that, in, say, Christianity as an example, we think of truth eventually being embodied and incarnate, right? It can't just be this disembodied abstraction. It has to be incarnate. And Fauci seems to be the incarnation of science, right? But rather scientism, another form of religion. Scientism is a religion. And so although we think we progressed, we think we've gotten away from superstitions of the ancient medieval world, no, in fact, magical masks one day will work, the next day they do not. They're magical devices. We LARP, we role play that we can be some other being, some other entity, some other gender, whatever. How long until we're in the metaverse saying that we're dragons or whatever, right?
It's going to be so great. When you're in your coom pod, it's going to be great. My name's Mark Zuckerberg, by the way.
That was Zuckerberg. Nobody knows what a coom pod is. Okay, well. See me over at my booth and I'll explain the coom pod to you. I'll give you some pictorial illustrations what a coom pod is. Now, I mentioned in terms of this order, the structure, this logos that exists in the world, that there's another system at work. And that system also, in an odd way, is not purely abstractions. It's not purely in the ether. It also is embodied. It embodies itself in a lot of historical instances, for example, in the ancient empires that sought to tyrannize, dominate, control man's population, force men to worship some bizarre manifestation of the king as God, etc. Well, that same world system, that Babel, that Nimrod system, it exists today. Why would we have the exact same system of the ancient world manifesting today in the writings of the elite that we can read? That baffles me. Isn't the most logical explanation that there is a grand narrative explanation for these things? That there is a meaning to history, that the ancient world was telling us something in terms of how the world is actually run? And today's speakers already have covered a lot of dark topics that show us that maybe there is actual evil. That's what the ancient medieval world said. Maybe they knew something that we've forgotten. You probably heard me do a lot of talks from Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. It's a formative text. It's absolutely necessary. Dr. Quigley was not a conspiracy theorist. He was the mentor to Bill Clinton. How dare you? I see Harrison Smith over there. How dare you, Harrison, just sit there with that smug look on your face. I'm going to have to give you a cigar tomorrow. See me and Monica after this. I'll give you a cigar. Now, he also wrote a book called The Anglo-American Establishment. This book, in certain ways, is even more informative and illustrative of how this system actually works. In this book, he says, I didn't really tell you everything in Tragedy and Hope. It was a really boring 1,300 pages. So I'm going to give you everything pretty much in this 300-page book. He says that around the time of the 1890s, the British elites, together with Lord Rothschild, together with the Cecils, together with Lord Milner, they decided that they would set up a secret society. Actually, a secret society. Modeled on the Jesuits. It's not the Jesuits. It's modeled on their structure. He says this society would infiltrate the power centers and the intellectual centers of the world, the media centers, etc. Banking, industry, education, etc. He said that we would be sure to ensure the continuity of this empire by incestuous intermarriage, literally. He said that we would use a faux form of democracy. The nations would think that it's democracy, but it would be run in the inner party on the basis of a socialist doctrine, a Fabian socialist doctrine. This is the Milner Circle. This is the City of London structure. This new world order, which they called it that, it comes from them. It would be an order where actuaries would decide in the future who would live and who would die based on the needs of nature, based on a new form of religion, Gaia worship, etc. All of those things would go into this new world order. And in this new world order, they would establish a logic, a structure that's the inverse of what we think of as the last 2,000 years. I'm just using that as an example. The last 2,000 years, for example, even though there's many failed attempts at this, the last 2,000 years of Christendom, etc., sought to instantiate basic principles of liberty, justice, order, logos, into all of society, civil society. And it did so because it had an end goal that was eternal. Man's meaning was not reduced to the here and the now. It continued on into the next life. It spills over into this life, but it also continues in the next life. If there is eternity, and again, remember Leibniz's argument from the eternality of truth, then it stands to reason that this world is not all that there is. There is an afterlife. There is a continuance of existence. And so we can't live according to a world structured on the basis of denying that on the here and the now alone. Now we know about Marxism. Marxism is specifically an atheistic philosophy that reduces man's meaning and his purpose to only the here and the now in this life. That's true. But today's world order is not strictly speaking Marxist. Don't misunderstand me. There's many Marxists out there, but it's not classical Marxism. It's a modified form which aligns with monopoly capital together with Marxism, Fabian socialism. That's the predominant idea behind the New World Order. But it has to be secular. It has to be without God. It has to be without logos, because the system has to give you your meaning and your purpose. The system now becomes the God. All you libertarians, you know, statism, we know this, right? Okay. But it's more than that. It's more than a problem of politics. These are philosophical problems. And I understand politics is under the domain of philosophy, political philosophy. It's more than ethics. It's metaphysical is what I'm trying to say. Once we start talking about creator and creature, once we start talking about the explanation for man's origins and his fall, we think of Genesis. For example, feminism. One of our friends, Rachel's here. She wrote a book called Occult Roots of Feminism and Witchcraft. You could never have the idea that you can be whatever you want to be and identify as whatever you want to be without feminism. Where does feminism come from? Is it just a Rockefeller-funded thing? It is, but it's not just that. If you go back to Genesis, we were told actually in Genesis, when man fell, the word was said to the woman, your desire shall be for your husband, but he shall rule over you. The word there means your desire will be to rule over the husband, but he will have authority over you. In other words, Genesis is telling us that the lie in the beginning, that we could be gods on our own without a God, involves fundamental revolution against logos and against order. That's exemplified not just in the woman, it's in the man and the woman, but they each rebel in their own way. Adam is lazy. He doesn't follow what he's supposed to do. He blames the woman. The woman blames the man. Again, we see this recapitulated in every marriage and relationship, I'm sure. But feminism comes from the garden, as does all forms of rebellion. Rebellion by the man as well, to not listen to divine law and telos and purpose. And so the purpose of what I'm saying to you is this, which is, let's think about this philosophically for a little bit here. Liberty, ethics, the good, these cannot be abstracted ideas. They have to be in some way explained, instantiated, embodied in some way. Even something that we think of as abstract, it might be embodied or existing in another way, another dimension, something like that. So just because something isn't, quote, physical, also doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Maybe things exist in different ways or in different modes, to use the helpful philosophical terms. So what I'm saying is that liberty might be also ultimately personal, not just an abstract concept. What if God is the source of liberty? What if that's where we can pivot our notions of liberty on? If we image God, then we have a basis to understand why there's right and wrong. It's not purely relative. If it's purely relative, whatever floats your boat, dude, right? Then it's not really right or wrong. So what I'm saying is this: intentionality. If we look at something like information science is interesting because it tells us that all meaningful information, however it's transferred, is always transferred from an intelligent agent to some specific end or purpose. We can understand that in the local level with computers and this and that, between me and you, conversations, right? But when we expand it to the macro level, the grand narrative of the universe, does it not make sense that reality itself is fundamentally information? I mean, physics, DNA, these things seem to tell us this now, that fundamental reality is meaningful and it's informative and it transmits information. And if that's the case, then I would posit that maybe the universe itself has a purpose, a telos, and is guided and directed. And that requires not merely human agents, but also a divine agent. Not just an abstraction, but a personal, a divine agent that ultimately gives meaning to the totality of uncreated being and created being. Thank you.